Good morning, guys, and we are live. Gosh, I don't think I've done a live stream in quite a few weeks, but I think now is an amazing time to do this because Bitcoin just hit all-time highs last night. We're sort of pulling back a little bit right now, but it just hit all-time highs last night of $126,000. The market is looking very interesting. It's a very strange cycle. So to talk about this, get some answers, I have a guest on the show today. So joining me today is very, very well-respected analyst, CEO, and founder of Into the Cryptoverse, which many of you have seen on YouTube and on X. We have Benjamin Cowen. Ben, welcome. What's up?
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, a really interesting time in the markets, and I'm happy to talk about my thoughts about it.
Yeah, I'm so happy that we're able to do this. The timing is perfect. You know, I will say this has actually been one of the most bizarre crypto cycles I personally have ever seen. So I've been in crypto for about 8 years now. And I think the last few cycles have been very repetitive. You know, it's like Bitcoin pumps first, you buy your altcoins when it crashes, and then we get our altcoin season, we make parabolic all-time highs. You know, we see this going for about 18 months to 2 years. It's quite typical. But this cycle has like thrown everyone off. So I'm really glad that you're here to shed some light on what the hell is going on. So I just want to go straight into it. What is your take right now? Bitcoin broke all-time highs last night of $126,000. Like, where are we right now? Like, are we at the top of the cycle? Are we just getting started? I'm confused. Like, what is going on?
That's a good question. I mean, and there's a lot of ways to look at it. I still subscribe to the 4-year cycle view, generally speaking. Not because I don't think it can never be broken, because at some point it probably will be. But I more so subscribe to it because until it does break, I feel like everyone's just better off assuming that it won't. And then at some point, when something changes, we can then adjust to that. But the 4-year cycle actually predates Bitcoin even. We've seen 4-year cycles well before. So I'm going to share my screen really quick, and that way people can follow along with my thought process. So if you can throw that up.
Yeah, I can add it up here. Add to stage.
So
okay, perfect.
Yeah, like, so if you look at so the purple line here is the current cycle, and then we have these other two cycles, the last two cycles. So if you measure the ROI from the low, we're further along in the cycle than maybe a lot of us are comfortable even thinking we are. Which, you know, I'm not at that point where I feel like it has to be, you know, over just yet. But there are a lot of indicators you would want to see. The interesting thing about this cycle is that a lot of the top indicators haven't actually signaled yet, right? So if you think about like the pi cycle top, or any metric that measures how euphoric the markets are, like the fear and greed, or the risk metrics that we have, or the terminal price indicator, right? There's so many different indicators that you could look at and say that, hey, none of these have actually fired off yet. So either this time is different and they're not going to, or there's another move ahead of us, right? Now, if you look at it from the low, it doesn't suggest we have much more time. If you measure the ROI of the cycle from peak to peak, then it's, you know, and you compare it to, say, 2 cycles ago, it would suggest we do have a little bit further to go, right? Like maybe Bitcoin can rally even into December. But the way I see it is that December is sort of like the best case scenario, right? So if we go look at all of Bitcoin's history and just kind of identify how the market cycles have historically come to an end, you typically have a local high in August or early September, like in 2013. Bitcoin then tests its 20-week simple moving average, or the 21-week EMA, in September. And then that usually sets up the final Q4 rally into the market cycle top. And again, the rally tends to peak in Q4 of the post-halving year, right? So you can pretty clearly see that you have August, September, and then a Q4 peak, all right? This is the same. I mean, this is how it is always every single cycle. The next cycle, you had the same thing. You had an August high, a September low at the 20-week moving average, the 21-week EMA as well, into the market cycle top in Q4 of the post-halving year. So you can see this pattern played out twice right there. And then if you go to last cycle, it played out as well. You have your local top. It was either late August, early September. You test the 20-week estimate, 21-week EMA in September, and then that sets up the rally into the Q4 market cycle top. So arguably, while it feels like this cycle is different, it hasn't really been that different, except we have had diminishing returns, which is unfortunately just a consequence of a exponentially higher market cap than we had in prior cycles. But even this cycle, if we zoom in, and I'm sure everyone knows what happened this cycle, we had an August top, a September low, and you could argue that, you know, what we've seen so far is just the rally into the final market cycle top in Q4, right? And we've already seen a new all-time high for Bitcoin in Q4. So I think it does make sense not to be complacent in the fourth quarter, because I would argue there is a high likelihood that the top will be in before the end of the year, at least for Bitcoin. And just and I'll send it back to you here in a second, but just so people are aware, this is not unique to Bitcoin. Like the idea of a 4-year cycle and in the midterm year lows, like we know 2014 was a bear market. 2018 was a bear market. 2022 was a bear market. What's really interesting is that a lot of people sort of equate the 4-year cycle with Bitcoin's halvings. But I think the 4-year cycle is actually more so based around the presidential election cycles. If you look at like the S&P 500 in prior decades, like in the 1960s and 1970s, look at all the major lows, right? You have 1962, 1966. These are 4 years apart. 1970, 1974, 1978, 1982, right? So the 4-year cycle exists outside of Bitcoin, right? It does exist outside of Bitcoin. And so I would say that I'm more so a believer in the 4-year cycle, because that's historically what happens. Now, there will come a time, as the S&P shows us, that we will likely deviate from the 4-year cycle, because it doesn't go on forever. But it is important to remember that, you know, what I do is I respect it until the market gives me a reason not to, and then I will pivot and change my mind until something else happens.
Thank you so much for that. You know, I also have a very similar opinion. You know, I think that everyone keeps going on about this cycle's different, but I've also been saying for a very long time that we're going to top in Q4. But everybody gets very upset and very emotional, you know, when we say that it's going to top in Q4. And I think the reason is because of what you mentioned. We've kind of seen diminishing returns this cycle. Like ETH hasn't really made much of an all-time high. You know, I think it touched it at like 4,900, but that's about it. So, you know, I'm curious then how you see Bitcoin dominance versus altcoin dominance playing out over the next few weeks, right? Because usually Bitcoin will break all-time highs and then altcoins will follow. Are we going to get, in your opinion, this massive blow off top for altcoins? Like, is ETH going to break out to 6K? What's your take on that? And also, sorry, I'll just also add one more thing before I let you answer. It's funny as well, because people often say that they think that we can't be anywhere near the top of the cycle because altcoins haven't really broken out, which I personally think is such a silly thing to say, because like you said, bigger market cap, lower diminishing returns. You know, we're not really, the market doesn't owe us a parabolic all-time high for alts.
Well, I think that a lot of people got jaded by the last cycle. Like in the last cycle, altcoins rallied against Bitcoin longer than they normally do. And you could say that it's because of interest rates were at like 0%. We were, you know, the Fed was pumping money into we had $6 trillion basically just pumped into the economy. So I think a lot of people got used to like what happened last cycle. And because of that, they then thought that was what's going to happen this cycle. And so it led to sort of a lot of people prematurely calling for Altseason. Now, Altseason, if you throw my screen up here, Altseason is the collapse of Bitcoin dominance while altcoins go up, right? So if we look, you can pretty clearly see the Altseason we had last cycle was right there, right? That's where dominance collapsed from its cycle high. In the cycle before that, you can also see we had an Altseason right here in December of 2017, right? And you can see they're pretty similar. In that cycle, you could argue the Altseason was also a little bit longer as well, but that was also the initial capitalization of the altcoin market, right? Like that was when the market caps were essentially nothing. And I think a lot of people sort of missed out on this idea that you have the initial capitalization of the market, and then you get to figure out like what the ultimate pattern is. And so what you're looking at, what people want is they want to see Bitcoin dominance collapse while basically Bitcoin USD goes sideways, right? And that means that usually altcoins are rallying a ton during that time. But I don't think we currently have the conditions to support that view. And the reason is because normally October is actually the best month for Bitcoin dominance, right? So if you go look at monthly returns for Bitcoin dominance, you'll see that I think on average it's like I don't even know, like it was like 5% or something on average. So Bitcoin dominance monthly returns, October on average it goes up about 4.5%. Now it's within one standard deviation, you know, or like what, like a 68% probability or whatever it is. It still could be anywhere between a 0 to 10% move approximately, but it is still the best month. Like dominance typically does well in the month of October. It's usually not until, you know, November or December where you might see dominance really start to fall and altcoins outperform Bitcoin. We've even seen that happen even in this cycle, right? Like even in this cycle, if you were to look at the collective valuation of the altcoin market, subtracting out USDT and divide it by Bitcoin, the major rallies that you've seen by alts have started in November, right? This was, so right here, if we get a, what am I looking for? An ellipse, right? So this rally right here was in November of 2024. And then this one right here started in November of 2023, right? Those two rallies right there did not start really until early November. And so I think while people assumed that there would be this immediate rotation into altcoins, what I think is actually more likely going to happen is that alts are going to roll over here against Bitcoin as liquidity flows back to Bitcoin. Now, this is the same thing, the exact same thing that happened in the last two cycles, right? So if you look at 2017, you can see that alts also rallied against Bitcoin. It's starting in August of 2017, and then they topped out, and then they started to go back down into October and early November, right? So the same thing is happening essentially from the same level, in fact, right? So you have this low that alts set against Bitcoin. They rally for a couple of months in the post-halving year. Everyone thinks it's alt season, but it's not, right? And the reason is because the timing is off. October is not typically alt season month. It's more so when liquidity flows back to Bitcoin. So in the short term, Bitcoin dominance should, unfortunately to the degens, like unfortunately, I mean, if people are like all in on alts and not Bitcoin, and you can see too, like last cycle, Bitcoin's parabolic rally more so happened in 2020, not the post-halving year. And even in that case, you can see that Bitcoin dominance found a low at the exact same level, right? Like at the exact same level in September, and then it rallied into the end of the year, right? Dominance rallied into December. Same thing in 2017, right? Dominance found a low in September, and then it rallied into the end of the year. So if you look at monthly returns on Bitcoin dominance, this trend becomes more obvious, right? Look at September. September typically marks a turning point for dominance, right? So September 2025, probably that's the low for dominance for the next couple of months. September 2020, that marked the low. September 2017, that marked the low. September of 2022, that marked the low. You can go through this and see that September is often a pivot point for Bitcoin dominance. Sometimes the other direction, right? Like if dominance is going up into September, then September marks a turning point where it starts to go down. But just go through the chart, September 2021. You'll see there was a nice rally by dominance into October at the end of the cycle. You still saw Bitcoin dominance drop later on that year, but not until the November timeframe. So my best guess right now is that Bitcoin dominance is going to go up in the short term, right? Like it should go up for the next, I would say for at least the next 4 weeks. Dominance should go back to the upside as liquidity flows back to Bitcoin. That is my best guess.
Okay, so it's looking pretty good, I guess, then for, what would you say, like November, December, for money to start moving into alts. We could potentially get that altcoin season people have been waiting for. but what type of altcoin season, because we are, like we both agreed, slowly coming towards the end. Like, really, how much upside potential is there going to be, even when Bitcoin dominance eventually comes down? Like, is Bitcoin, do you see Ethereum breaking out beyond 6K, Solana to $500, or are we just kind of asking too much at this point?
I think Ethereum will go to a new all-time high. So here's Ethereum. My view on Ethereum has basically been that it would sweep the all-time high. So if you throw my screen up, so basically I said, all right, after Ethereum goes to its lower regression band, right, which it kind of was elusive for the entire cycle, right, but after it went here, then the point was that it should then rally to all-time highs, kind of like we've seen in prior cycles, right? So after it goes, I've said home, it should then rally to all-time highs. And also, if you overlay the ETH valuation against Bitcoin onto the chart, you'll notice that ETH tends to bottom against Bitcoin after it goes to its regression band. So I think that Ethereum has bottomed against Bitcoin for this market cycle, right? Like, I don't think the ETH Bitcoin valuation will go lower than it was in April for this market cycle. What I think is the most likely outcome for Ethereum is it should go to a new all-time high. I'm not convinced it's going to do it this month, right? I was convinced that Bitcoin would, because Bitcoin normally breaks out in October, and it already has gone to an all-time high. But Ethereum isn't as easy to predict in that sense. Like, if you look at 2017, Bitcoin was going to new all-time highs in October, right? So look at 2017, the 2017 cycle, you can see that Bitcoin made a new all-time high pretty early in the month, just like we have this cycle, right? The week of October 9th, Bitcoin made a new all-time high. And you would think that if Bitcoin were rallying like that, you would probably think Ethereum would be going with it, right? Like, that would make sense. But what actually happened back then, that's not what happened. While Bitcoin was making new all-time highs, Ethereum was not, right? So it was basically still below these lows until late November, right? It didn't actually break out until late November, even though Bitcoin was going parabolic. Like, I mean, and that's the thing that I think a lot of people miss, is that you only really have two, I feel like, in my mind anyways, there's two realistic outcomes, right? You either get the parabolic rally in Q4, or you don't, right? Like, it's got to be one of those two things. And if you just logically think about this, if Bitcoin were to go parabolic in Q4, like it did in 2017, then people are going to FOMO into Bitcoin, and they're going to trade their altcoins for Bitcoin, just like they did in 2017 and just like they did in late 2020, right? Because that's what a lot of times fuels that final parabolic rally. It's the capitulation of all the people that have been buying altcoins that feel like they're getting left behind, because there's this common thing in finance where what a lot of people do is they'll sell their winners to buy the losers, because they'll think that the losers will start winning and the winners will start losing, right? It's the same thing that, like, think about Nvidia this cycle, right? Like, everyone keeps calling the top on Nvidia, and it just keeps on going higher. A lot of people buy micro cap stocks because they're like, well, they'll certainly catch up, and they never have caught up. The same thing is happening in crypto, right? Like, people keep thinking that all these altcoins will catch Bitcoin, and they buy the alts instead of Bitcoin, and then Bitcoin just continues to outperform. So if you get the parabolic rally in Q4, liquidity flows back to Bitcoin, all right? If you don't get the parabolic rally in Q4, which hopefully we do, but if you don't, then every time we have seen Bitcoin drop this cycle, altcoins typically drop more, right? Like think about every 10% flush that Bitcoin's had, altcoins drop like 30% or something. So for me, it just makes it easy to hold mostly Bitcoin. I'm kind of like, I think I'm like 80-20, like 80% Bitcoin. My crypto portfolio is like 80% Bitcoin, 20% ETH. But the reason it makes it easy to hold Bitcoin is because if we get the parabolic rally, I'm going to want to hold Bitcoin. And if we don't get the parabolic rally, Bitcoin dominance is still likely going to go up in the month of October. So I do think Ethereum will make an all-time high again. But I think it could still take a few weeks. in order for that to play out. I think you have to see, there's some moving averages that I think need to kind of catch up. Like the 20-week SMA and the 21-week EMA for Ethereum are a little lower right now, and they're slowly catching up. I think after those catch up, Ethereum will then pop back up to an all-time high. But I could see it lagging Bitcoin just like it did in 2017.
But in order to get that parabolic run, whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's altcoins, like whatever it is, there's going to need to be more liquidity coming into the market. So I know obviously the Fed have cut rates and they're expected to continue to cut rates. But my question is, where is that liquidity going to come from? Especially given the fact that you mentioned at the beginning that those top indicators aren't really there right now, like fear and greed index, like mainstream media, for example, aren't really talking about it. You don't have like those normies FOMOing in, which will obviously bring more liquidity. So like, how would we even get that if there's not really more liquidity coming in? Is it just a matter of like simply everything's going to rotate? That's kind of already existing, because that's kind of what we're seeing, I guess.
Yeah, and that's a great question. If you throw this chart out, this really interesting chart, it's the social risk. You can see that like this year is, well, like a lot of people keep saying it is different. It is different in the sense that no one's here, right? Like,
yes,
like there's dozens of us left at this point. But if you look at the social risk, you can see in 2017, 2018, there was a major top. In 2021, there was a major top. Right now, like where is everyone? You know, like did everyone just get tired of getting rugged? Like,
I think so.
did they lose all their money on meme coins? Like, I don't know. Are they struggling to pay for groceries because inflation has gone sky high? Like, I don't know where everyone is. I do think normally people come back because altcoins go up, right? And altcoins haven't really gone up in the same way, as you said earlier. Those haven't gone up in the same way as they have in prior cycles. Some of them are doing well, right? Like some of them, like Solana did really well in 2023 and 2024. Ethereum did well a few months ago. We see other coins doing, like BNB is doing really well, like right this minute. It's not like nothing is doing well. It's just that the collective market isn't doing well. And so it's not really bringing people back. I think in order to have a full-blown alt season, you have to get Ethereum to stay above $5,000, right? In order to bring people back, there's a lot of people that bought Ethereum in 2021 that have been underwater for the last 4 years, right? And anyone who bought any altcoin remotely related to it, they've also been underwater for the last several years. A lot of times in prior cycles, Ethereum and other altcoins, or some of the altcoins, they were breaking new all-time highs well before now, and that brought people back. This cycle, it just seems like we're either waiting for it to all happen at the very end, like the last month or two, or it's just not going to happen. This chart, by the way, is made up of a lot of different indicators, like YouTube views, people following people on Twitter. So if you look at YouTube views, we have like, I track a few different crypto YouTube channels. If you look at these YouTube channels, there's, 30 or 40 of them. Collectively, they're averaging less than 1 million views right now. Whereas at the peak in 2021, they were collectively averaging 3 to 4 million views.
Right.
So you can see there's a complete difference in interest right now than there was back then. And if you think about it, because there's not a lot of interest, it makes sense that Bitcoin dominance has spent so much of the cycle going up. Because at the end of the day, there's only one Bitcoin, and there's infinitely more altcoins printed every single day. And so you basically have the people that are going to buy Bitcoin will keep on buying it no matter how many altcoins there are. But there's also there's people that will buy altcoins over Bitcoin, but the number of altcoins just keeps increasing, so liquidity just keeps getting spread thinner and thinner and thinner amongst the altcoins that exist. So in order to see Bitcoin dominance collapse, you first need to see higher altcoin prices, but you need to see people actually come back, because if people don't come back, where's the liquidity going to come from to send altcoins a lot higher to then make Bitcoin dominance drop? And that's just something we haven't seen yet. And I've been tracking this really closely to see, like, are people coming back? And every time there's like a rally, it'll spike above 2 million, and then it just ends up being a single spike, and then people don't stick around. So it's a tough market, because if you bought Bitcoin, you're doing well. And if you bought a few select altcoins, you're doing well. But if you just bought like a random I mean, I'm going to say altcoins rather than say the other word, right? But
Yeah.
if you just bought a lot of random altcoins and they got rugged, then you're probably just hoping for an altcoin season. There's a chance that you can still get one, but you mentioned monetary policy. Again, stop me if I'm going on too long.
No, you're good.
But one of the reasons, I mean, at the end of the day, in the 2017 cycle, you could argue that if you ignore the initial capitalization of the altcoin market, you could argue that the alt season didn't even really start until November or December, right?
Mm-hmm.
In 2020, you could argue that it didn't really start until December. So it's October now, so there's still a chance that it all happens. But if you said, hey, Ben, I don't want you to look at prior cycles. I want you to explain through the lens of monetary policy why altcoins have lagged Bitcoin for so long. The argument I would make is that that monetary policy is still restrictive, like Jerome Powell says it is. And the way you can kind of identify that is if you look at interest rates, they're currently at 4.25%. There's this abstract concept called the neutral rate, right? So the neutral rate is the rate at which if the Fed funds rate is above, the economy slows down, and if the Fed funds rate is below, the economy expands and starts to accelerate. The Fed funds rate, a lot of people don't even agree on it, but an approximation of the Fed funds rate could be the 2-year yield, right? If you're doing like a Sharpe ratio or Sortino ratio calculation, and you're trying to figure out like what the risk-free rate is, the argument is that the 2-year yield is approximately equal. You could use the 2-year yield as an approximation for the risk-free rate. And so the argument that I'm trying to make is essentially that the 2-year yield, if you look at the Fed funds rate and you subtract out the 2-year yield, it is still positive, right? It's still positive. And the argument is that in order for an alt season, you could argue that it needs to be below zero, right? Like you could argue that it needs to be below zero. The alt season of 2017, happened when the Fed funds rate was below the neutral rate. The alt season in 2021, a lot of it happened as the Fed funds rate it dropped below the neutral rate right here. It then got a sort of a dead cat bounce. And then we had this massive alt season, right? Like in 2021. So I think from a monetary policy perspective, you could argue that, hey, as long as the Fed funds rate is sufficiently restrictive, then it's going to dampen higher risk assets, their return relative to lower risk assets. But, there is a chance that the Fed funds rate goes below the neutral rate, again, by the end of the year. If you go look at expectations for the Fed funds rate, right now, the expectation is that by December, it will be at 3.75% by December. Well, again, if you look at the 2-year yield, it's at about 3.6%. So by the end of the year, maybe monetary policy does get a little bit looser, and maybe that allows for the market to behave in a different way. But yeah, I mean, like we're not at that point yet. I still think we're at the point where Bitcoin should continue to dominate most of the flows.
Yeah. By the way, you can say shitcoin because that's what they are.
Right. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to offend anyone. It's
okay.
The thing with shitcoins is that they're not even unique to crypto, right? Like in the stock market, they're called shitcos, right? Like shit companies. It's all the same stuff.
Yeah, well, they haven't moved really this cycle, so they are literally by definition shitcoins.
Right.
But we're trying to figure out like where this liquidity is going to come from. We're talking about monetary policy, but what makes this cycle particularly interesting, and I want to get your take on, is a lot of people have called this particular cycle the Great Rotation, because you could argue that we have had altcoin season. It's just not looked how altcoin season typically looks, right? So altcoin season typically looks like ETH breaking all-time highs, then the money trickles down, and then everything and anything just pumps. But, Solana broke all-time highs back in January when Trump got inaugurated. And actually during that period, from November to like February, a lot of normies were FOMOing in because they thought, well, Trump is really pro-crypto. That was kind of like a top-ish signal, because I know a lot of people who bought Doge and all these different random memes because they really thought like, this is it. This is where they're going to make money. And obviously they got wrecked. But then we've got things like Asta now, which completely pumped out of nowhere. So that's a sign of altcoin season. You know, and all these major coins that have pumped out of nowhere have really, they've been like gravity. They've basically like stolen the liquidity from the entire market. That's what the Trump coin did. That's certainly what the Melania coin did. So do you think maybe, you know, the whole cycle has been one big altcoin season? We even had a whole year of meme coin seasons, you know, where that sucked all the liquidity. Like the money went straight from Bitcoin all the way down into memes, and it completely surpassed the blue chip alts like Bitcoin, like ETH and Solana. So yeah, what's your take? Do you think like maybe actually altcoin season has already been and we're kind of living it? XRP broke out, BNB is making all-time highs. Like it's kind of here, isn't it?
I think that it's selective, right? So it's more of like maybe think about it like this. In 2021, like anyone, no matter how clueless they were, could throw money in an altcoin and they'd make money, right? This cycle is different in the sense that we haven't had that. You've more so had to like stock pick, right? Or altcoin pick, and in order to actually see returns. So if you look at this chart, this is total 2 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. So like you could say that this rally by right here, this is so the altcoin valuation against Bitcoin, this was like ETH season, right? And then the one in you said in late 2024, early 2025, right? Like it was what? Solana season, right? Because Solana was putting in a new all-time high. So you have like selective seasons where one altcoin, like 1 or 2 altcoins might run against Bitcoin, but the issue is that the entire market, the entire altcoin market isn't running together. And so while it feels euphoric, if you held Solana in 2023 and 2024, it felt euphoric, right? If you've held Ethereum since April, it feels euphoric. If you held whatever shit coins were pumping in late 2023, right? Like it felt euphoric. The problem is like just because it feels euphoric for you or a few of the followers of any of us, the like majority of people were not all in on Ethereum or all in on Solana. They had baskets of a lot of random altcoins that they held from 2020 and 2021 that they were hoping that if they held on to long enough, they would eventually see all-time highs. But unfortunately, a lot of those didn't do that. Now, you mentioned Solana, Ethereum, and XRP, so I'll just go through those 3 examples really quick. What you look for any individual altcoin to rally against Bitcoin, you first hope for a double bottom, right? And so Solana got that a few years ago. Like if you look at the Sol Bitcoin valuation, when you get these types of moves here where you have like a low and then a double bottom, that's usually when the altcoin will then like rally up against Bitcoin. Solana, by the way, is following Ethereum's blueprint, like almost perfectly, right? It's like if you overlay, it's just delayed by like a couple of years or something. But if you take this on a log scale and you take it, you take this chart and then you overlay it with the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. I probably should take Ethereum's Bitcoin valuation and overlay it on Solana, to be completely honest. But you can see like it's a very similar, like type of move.
Oh wow,
right? And you can see that like Ethereum had that same double bottom in its first bear market, right? Like it had its double bottom, it then rallied, and then ultimately it fell back off, right? And it came back down near the lows just a few months ago. You could argue that Sol Bitcoin is doing the same thing. By the way, quick segue, if you look at the ETH market cap valuation against Bitcoin, this is one of the reasons why I was so bullish on Bitcoin dominance back in 2021 and 2022, is because I operate under the assumption that altcoins are oscillators at best. And when they're at the top of the range, you have to be prepared for them to go to the bottom of the range, right? And a lot of people weren't prepared for that back in 2022 at the merge. The same thing happened to Solana back in early 2025, where you have sort of this initial capitalization on the market, but you have this range, and no one over here was prepared to be like, oh, it could possibly go back down. And now we've had this, this other rally as well. But I mean, honestly, within a couple of years, you'll probably see Sol Bitcoin valuation back down where Ethereum's Bitcoin valuation eventually went to. And whenever it goes down there, it'll probably get another big rally off of it. But again, it's going to be a slow process, and that doesn't mean it can't rally first in the short term. But if you see that play out like a double bottom where the second low is a slightly higher low, that's usually a really good sign of a nice rally, right? So like look at
Mm-hmm.
ETH, Bitcoin here, slightly higher low, you get this massive rally. Sol Bitcoin, same thing, right? A slightly higher low, you got a massive rally. XRP Bitcoin, you had a same thing, right? You had a low and then a slightly higher low in November. And I haven't talked about a whole lot of altcoins this cycle, but this is one of the ones I talked about on my channel because it was just an obvious,
Yeah.
sort of double bottom that even last cycle kind of led to the same type of spike, right? Led to the same type of spike. So that's what you look for. With Ethereum this cycle, we didn't get that. We didn't get a double bottom. But Ethereum's, I think it's arguably a cycle ahead of something like Solana because it was around a cycle before Solana. So the price action is a cycle ahead of it. What Ethereum is doing historically is it's putting in higher lows on its Bitcoin pair, but it's also putting in lower highs on its Bitcoin pair. So you could argue, right? I think you could make the argument that it's converging to quote unquote whatever the fair value is. Now, if you're a toxic Bitcoin maxi, you're just going to say it's going to go down. And look, honestly, maybe it will. Like I don't know, but I will say there's a chance that you're seeing sort of like a logarithmic regression type search for whatever that fair value of the asset is on its Bitcoin pair. So I don't think Ethereum is going to ever flip Bitcoin. If ETH were to ever put in a lower low on its Bitcoin pair, it probably just means it wouldn't mean anything good, right? Because then you have lower highs and lower lows. Now there's a silver lining. You have lower highs and higher lows. But if that were to ever change, then, I mean, at that point, I don't understand how anyone wouldn't just turn into a Bitcoin maxi at that point. Because if not even the number 2 by market cap can hold on, then what hope? What hope does event? The problem is that any altcoin can outperform Bitcoin for one cycle, maybe 2, but over a long enough period of time, it just seems like all of it ends up bleeding back to Bitcoin.
Yeah, I want to talk about the fact that this cycle has been really different. We spoke about liquidity rotating, alts not really performing and behaving how they usually do. And, in my opinion, a massive reason for that is just because of mass adoption, really, because we've seen, we've got the spot ETF. So Bitcoin obviously broke all-time highs earlier than usual. Usually it breaks all-time highs after the halving. This time it happened before the halving. So, it's really different. And the cycle has been really disrupted. So with that in mind, with all this money flowing in with the ETFs, we've got the Bitcoin ETF, the Ethereum ETF, maybe there'll be a Solana ETF. I don't know. But what's your take on the idea that we could actually get a super cycle? Because often when I say Q4 things will top, I can't predict whether it's going to be, September or December, but it's going to be somewhere. That's my opinion. But when I say that, people scream super cycle. I personally think that's just hopium, and I think it's a really dangerous mentality. But do you think there's any chance that the idea of a super cycle is likely?
I mean, I think it would be irresponsible of me to say that it's like there's 0% chance.
Okay, yeah, fair enough.
Because it's a market, and who knows what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But I think eventually the market humbles everyone. But I will say, I would say I have to go into this assuming it's not a super cycle, right? There's some people talking about it being like a 5-year cycle, but I feel like, calling for a 5-year cycle is just repackaging the super cycle terminology into something that looks a little bit more attractive and not as crazy. I think that next year will be a bear market, right? Just to put it out there. I mean, I think it will be. If you look at, let me show my screen here. So if you look at year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin in midterm years, so like 2014, 2018, and 2022, tends to be a bear market, right? It would be hard for me to look at this chart and be like, oh no, next time's going to be different, right? 2026 is going to be different. At the end of the day, I don't really view it as a bad thing that you have these bear market years. I think it's a good way to get the froth out and to allow for the people that are actually trying to innovate, those people to hopefully survive. I think that next year will be a bear market.
Yeah.
My guess, and I'm just guessing, I don't know, but my guess is that Bitcoin will have about a 70% drawdown from whatever the peak is.
Oh, wow,
so,
70%. Okay.
Yeah, and I think it'll take place over the span of 1 year. And the reason I came up to that 70% number is, I mean, if you look at all prior bear markets, we're looking at essentially, and again, I'm not saying it has to be 70% from the current top, right? Like just 70% from whatever the all-time high is. If you look at it, unfortunately, we had diminishing returns, right? No one likes diminishing returns, and everyone wishes it would be something different. But the good thing about diminishing returns is you get diminishing losses as well. So the first bear market, Bitcoin dropped about 94%. The second bear market, it dropped about 87. The third bear market, it dropped about 84. And then the fourth bear market, it dropped about 76%. So you can see that the bear markets are getting a little bit more bearable, right? Like they're not they're not as bad, right? They're not as bad. No one wants to live through a 70% drawdown, right? Like no one wants to live through that and deal with it. But I mean, like it is a reality of Bitcoin's bull markets that it leads to these kind of difficult bear markets. If you look at like the S&P 500, since the low in 2022, it's rallied about 92%, right? Bitcoin has rallied what, like 700% or something, like
yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, like 700%. So, getting a drawdown like that isn't completely absurd. It's not. So I would say what I would be looking for is approximately a 70% drawdown from whatever the all-time high is. And the low should be approximately 1 year after the top. So if the top is in October, then the low should be in October of next year, right? If the top is in December, then the low will probably be in December of next year. The super cycle stuff, I don't subscribe to. I will say that if the only way that something could be maybe misinterpreted for that is if you get like a bear market in 2026 and then it, like, how this cycle we put in a new all-time high before the halving.
Yes.
Like if that were to happen again, but maybe even earlier, then maybe it would be construed as a super cycle. But I think like I have to operate under the assumption of if it's not broke, don't fix it. Every midterm year has been a bear market. I will assume that next year will be a bear market, and I will assume that the fourth quarter of this year will mark the market cycle top. I will be prepared to be wrong about that. Like if I'm wrong at any point in 2026, if Bitcoin puts in an all-time high, I'll just say, all right, yeah, like I was wrong, and now it's time to pivot to something else. But I will say, if you go into 2026 not knowing what to do, and you still want exposure to crypto, even if there is a chance of a 70% drawdown, like, Bitcoin's a better hold than most altcoins in midterm years, right? So the only way that 2026 ends up being a good year for other things in crypto is if Bitcoin does well first, right? So normally what I do in midterm years, at the very least, if you don't want to sell your Bitcoin, at the very least, I think it's safe to convert altcoins to Bitcoin. Because again, look at this cycle. What happens? Bitcoin hit an all-time high way before most everything.
Yeah. So let's talk about this 70% drawdown, because, I speak with people in crypto a lot, and my brother and I work together, and we have this theory that it doesn't really matter how high Bitcoin goes. We think that when it crashes, obviously, it crashes hard. When it crashes, it might crash down to the price where the ETF was approved. So it was at $40,000 that suddenly all this institutional money flood in, right? And because of that, Bitcoin then rallied before the halving. So it's really due to the ETF that everything started much earlier and Bitcoin started rallying. So do you think there's a potential here whereby, forget how high Bitcoin goes, when it crashes, it's probably likely to crash to around $40,000, just because all those people that got in, these are institutional, these are like typical traditional financial investors, right? So they're used to like 10% returns a year, whereas suddenly they're getting these massive returns that they've never really gotten before with Bitcoin. Once we get to the top of the market, they're going to just completely exit, and all this money is going to flow out of the ETF, bringing Bitcoin back down to where it was before it was approved, which would be 40K. What's your take on that theory?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. The ETF stuff, it's funny because, the ETFs for Bitcoin seemed a lot more bullish than the ETFs for Ethereum when the Ethereum ETFs were launched. Like no one really seemed to care. So I guess, to sort of back out your theory of that, then we would say, all right, well, let's, again, it's all dubious speculation. No one knows what the hell is going to happen.
Yeah.
But, you know, if there is a 70% drawdown, and if the low is the ETF low, then you back that out and say, well, what would the price of Bitcoin have to be such that a 70% drop would put it at the ETF valuation, right? So let's do that really quick. You know, if you look at the ETF valuation, where was it? So yeah, like around 42K or something like that, 40K.
Yeah.
So let me just look on my screen here. So, so a 70% drop to get to this valuation right here, right?
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit higher.
Can you zoom in a little bit? Can you zoom in? It's just a little hard to see. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So I get it. So if you had a 70% drop to get down to that level, then, and you look at the price, right? You know, maybe 140, 150
seems
is
likely.
a possibility. Like if that is how it plays out. I mean, I don't really know where the low is, but I will say this: like if the high is you know, if the high ends up being in December, which is the best case scenario as far as I'm concerned, then that would put the low December 2026, right? So, you know, to December 2026 on this chart would be about here, right? It'd be about there. So yeah, maybe it would even be like back testing this thing, right? Like this, you know, this lower high structure. I don't really know. I mean, I think what I would look for though, Leia, is I would say all prior, you know, I don't know if all these cycle top indicators are going to trigger or not. I hope they do. But I will say this. Every cycle has been over when a couple of things happened, right? Number one, whenever Bitcoin had 2 weekly closes below the 50-week moving average, the cycle was over, okay? So, and you can see that in every cycle, right? In 2013, 2014, weekly closes below the 50-week moving average, that was it, right? The next cycle, again, same thing. The next cycle, the same thing. We haven't had a weekly close below the 50-week moving average this cycle, right? We haven't. And right now, the 50-week moving average is at $101,000. So what I would say is if you get any weekly closes below 100K at this point, at this late in the cycle, that's the sign the cycle is over, right? At this point. So I think it makes sense to remain optimistic until you get weekly closes below the 50-week moving average, or until all those peak indicators that everyone has spent so many years developing, if those were to flash, then you could sell into that, right? But if they don't flash, then watch for that. The other indicator, it's kind of a hand-wavy indicator, but it's remarkable how accurate it has been, is that every cycle top has always occurred either when or just before the 200-week moving average crosses the prior all-time high, okay? So look at this, and you know, you'll see kind of like what I'm talking about. So the first cycle, right? You see the peak here?
Yeah.
That's the 200-week SMA. When the 200-week moving average crossed that prior all-time high, that was the top, right? That was the top. All right, now go to this peak, right? So when Bitcoin, when the 200-week SMA crossed this all-time high, that was the top, right? So you have two clear examples. When the 200-week moving average crosses prior all-time high, the top was in. The next cycle wasn't as useful, but it got it pretty close. When Bitcoin's 200-week SMA crossed the prior cycle high, it was a little late, right? By a few weeks. Now, the reason I bring this up is because the 200-week moving average right now is at approximately $54,000, right? So the prior all-time high was 69K.
Yeah.
My argument is that, you know, by the time that, say, the 50-week or by the time the 200-week moving average reaches, you know, 60K or something, we have to really start thinking critically about, like, how much longer do we truly have, you know, rather than just keeping, you know, continuing to think that every dip will eventually be brought up. So that's just another indicator to look for. By the way, if you want me to go through some of the peak indicators, I can, to show you guys.
Yeah, let's go through it briefly, because like I said, you know, everyone is lost right now. Like, no one is able to predict what's going on. So yeah, let's take a look at the peak indicators.
Yeah, so here's some top indicators.
Yeah.
So here's the pi cycle top indicator.
Can you zoom in at all? It's quite small. Just a little bit if you can.
Yeah.
Yes. Beautiful. So much better. Thank you.
Yeah. So this one, by the way, this is a tricky one. I will say this. If we get a parabolic rally in Q4, do not wait for this one to signal. And the reason why is because every cycle, it's gotten closer to not crossing, right? So in 2013, it crossed easily. In 2017, it crossed and stayed crossed for a few days or a few weeks. In 2021, it only crossed for like a couple of days and then it was done. So what you do is you don't throw the indicator out because you think it's not. Take the delta. So divide the moving averages, and you can see what I'm talking about. You can see that every cycle has been putting in a lower peak, right?
Yeah.
So in order for the pi cycle top to flash, the moving averages have to cross, meaning this indicator has to go above 1, right? Last cycle, it only barely went above 1. The cycle before that, it easily went above 1, right? Like 1.07. The cycle before that, it was 1.2 or something. So the point is if you draw a line between these peaks, it means it's not going to cross. It's not going to flash this cycle. But it doesn't mean that Bitcoin can't go higher. It just means that that indicator might not flash in the traditional sense. But if you dig deeper into it, you might see that it is flashing. It's just that those moving averages might not cross. So that's one of them. Some other top indicators are, you have the terminal price. The terminal price, this is one of the more bullish topping indicators because we're nowhere near, where the normal top would be. Nowhere near it. And so again, it's either this cycle is different or it's yet to happen. And again, regardless of what happens between now and the next month, if this cycle is different, you're better off with Bitcoin. And if it's not different, you're still better off with Bitcoin for at least the next month.
Right.
So that's another indicator. There are some other ones that look a little bit. Here's the risk metric, right? If you look at like the risk levels on Bitcoin, we're not as euphoric as we were at prior market cycle tops, right? Like
100%.
Yeah, and I think everyone feels that. I mean, at the end of the day, Bitcoin is only like $12,000 higher than it was 9 months ago on January 20th. Like it's not even that much higher over the last 9 months. So it makes sense that there's not really a lot of euphoria right now because Bitcoin hasn't really moved a whole lot. There's other indicators we can look at, like the MVRV score. This one still seems kind of low compared to spikes we've seen in the past. I feel like there's a couple that might be a little bit more like if you look at the free float market value to realized value ratio and you draw a line through this, it would suggest we're maybe a little bit closer to the top than people think. At the end of the day, all models are wrong. Some are useful. And I think people need to figure out what's going to work for them. And I think just coming up with a strategy and sticking to it, not putting too much faith into any single indicator, I think is the way to go.
Okay, I just have 2 more questions for you. We can keep them brief. I don't want to keep you too long. But my first question is just to change perspective a little bit. What's your view on the whole mentality of hodl forever versus take profit? Because after this whole conversation, we can both agree you're not necessarily married to the 4-year cycle, but you definitely believe in it, and you definitely believe in bull and bear cycles. So what's your mentality on, okay, if Q4 is the blow off top, why don't we take profit on Bitcoin in Q4, hold our stables, and then go back in a year from now when it crashes? Or are you more of the mentality of if it's going up forever, of course we're going to have bull and bear cycles. Why don't I just ride the whole thing and just wait 10 years until it goes to $1 million per Bitcoin?
Usually what I do is I sell all the altcoins that I have, I would say by mid-January at the absolute latest. And that's only if Bitcoin's putting in new all-time highs in December. As far as Bitcoin goes, I generally do sell some, especially in Q4 of the post-halving year, but I never recommend selling everything because it's just kind of like the recognition that we don't know what's going to happen and we don't have a crystal ball. So what I do is I normally sell some and then I try to wait at least 6 months. If you think about Bitcoin's bear markets, a lot, last bear market, most of the drop was in the first half of the midterm year, right? Because Bitcoin was already at 20K by May or June, right? It was already pretty low. So I think if you do sell some in Q4, I think you would then maybe want to look back, look into potentially starting to reaccumulate about 6 months later, and then just continue to accumulate through the end of the year. Because again, like in 2022, we had a big capitulation in the summer, and then Bitcoin only marginally went lower in November with the FTX collapse, and a lot of people, even though they were right, they didn't necessarily buy any.
So I did. Just gonna put that out there. I did.
That's good.
I bought 0.8. I remember.
Yeah, I mean that's great. Yeah. I mean that's great because a lot of people were too scared to buy. I mean, I basically just stick to the risk levels, and back then the risk metric was like 0.1, 0.2. I think it was like 0.2, and normally that's the time to buy Bitcoin. So, I would argue just if you do sell any at the end of the year, and the market does go into a bear market, then I would start looking to accumulate about 6 months later. If you sell some and it doesn't go into a bear market, that's going to be a tough thing to navigate. But I think that's the reason why you don't sell everything, right? That's the reason why you hold on to some of it, because at the end of the day, anyone who lived through 2022, I mean, it sucked, but they're all doing fine now, right? And that was a worse drawdown than maybe what we'll have in 2026. Like 2022, we had a 77% drawdown, and Bitcoin still went to all-time highs. So yeah, I would always have like a hodl stack, or a hodl stack, whatever you call it. I would always have one of those just in case, but I don't think it makes sense to hold a lot of altcoins in the midterm year, because if Bitcoin does drop 70%, then most alts will drop a lot more. The funny thing is, like, people say, well, you never say it's a good time to hold altcoins. But like that's the point, right? Like the point is that Bitcoin is the way to go for most people. And if you do want to get into the altcoin market, that's fine, but just recognize that it's going to be a short-term trade, right? Like there's not, like, most people who bought altcoins in 2013 were not happy. They were still holding those same altcoins by 2021, right? Just like if you bought altcoins in 2017, I remember in 2013, we had BBQ coin, who the hell knows what that's doing today, right? In 2017, we had Dash, and we had Monero and Litecoin, and none of those have done a damn thing in the last decade. And in 2021 there was a lot of altcoins, and I guess I'm gonna by 2030 there's gonna be a lot of people that are gonna be holding on to those same altcoins for the better part of a decade, and wishing they had at least converted to Bitcoin. Every cycle there's probably always going to be a new shiny altcoin that you can use to argue like why Bitcoin dominance is not important. But I think the way to be successful in crypto is to start off with Bitcoin. And if you want to keep it easy, just stick with Bitcoin and forget about everything else. You might miss a few altcoin rallies, but you're not going to get rugged by the developer, right? So that's a good thing.
Yeah.
If you want to go beyond that and you want to increase the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio by trading altcoins, I think you can do that. Like I bought a decent amount of Ethereum back in April when it was capitulating. And, I want to increase the Satoshi valuation of my portfolio by then converting back. And I think the time to convert back is going to be in a few months. So that's how I navigate crypto.
Yeah. Just my last final question. You don't need to go into too much detail. We've already been going for nearly an hour, so I don't want to keep you. But, a lot of people like to look at Bitcoin and they say it's very correlated to the stock market, tech stocks, Nvidia, and so on. So I'm just curious to get your take on whether you think that is an accurate thing to follow, and also whether you expect a decoupling to happen anytime soon.
No, I mean, they're very much correlated to each other. Yeah. Like if you look at, let me see if I can. I guess I think the thing with Bitcoin and the NASDAQ is that Bitcoin almost operates as like a levered version of the NASDAQ, like a more volatile version of the NASDAQ. Like if the NASDAQ's going up 100, 200%, Bitcoin's usually going up 700, 800%. If the NASDAQ is dropping 20 or 30%, then Bitcoin's normally dropping 50 or 60%. So I do think Bitcoin trades more like a risk asset, than a risk off asset. And that I don't like that. To me, that's not a bad thing, because for the last 15 years, we've been in a massive bull market, and if Bitcoin had traded like a risk asset, then it would have traded like gold and gone basically nowhere for 10 or 15 years. Now we're going into different market conditions where gold is really doing well. And I've been really bullish on gold for the last several years, and other commodities. But I do think that, if you're looking for a lot of like diversification, whether if you go buy the QQQ and say, well, I'm going to diversify by holding Bitcoin, like that's not that much diversification. You still have exposure to, things that are going to move mostly in tandem with each other. If you want diversification, you need to buy other things. Like you need to buy commodities, real estate, though I don't think real estate's a great buy right now. Bonds, but even bonds, I mean, like, the yields, the 10-year yield, I think is going to go up again because, they're probably going to try to save things like they always do. And that means we're going to start worrying about, an economy that's starting to heat back up, and that would send the yields higher. So yeah, I would say if you're looking to diversify, just buying a lot of people that have, if you buy one altcoin and then you think like, oh, I'll diversify by buying these 5 others, you're not diversifying, right? They all move together usually, except for the occasional altcoin that goes against that. So yeah, those are my views.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for coming on. It's been so interesting. I just feel like this is the perfect time to have this conversation because, we're in Q4. We both believe we're reaching the top of the market, and I feel like everybody's very confused as to what on earth is going on. So thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. A pleasure to be here.
All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you're not already, make sure you drop Ben a follow so you can stay up to date on what's going on in the market. All right, we'll see you all next week for another live stream. Bye-bye.